Welcome back to The Full View. President Cyril Ramaphosa has joined world leaders in Egypt for the Cairo Peace Summit. On the agenda, the continuing Israel-Hamas conflict. Arab leaders have condemned Israel's two-week bombardment of Gaza and are demanding renewed efforts to reach a Middle East peace settlement to end the decades-long cycle of violence between Israelis and Palestinians. The summit comes as Israel prepares to launch a ground assault on Gaza following Hamas's attack that killed around 1,400 civilians in Israel. More than 4,100 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's counteroffensive. President Ramaphosa, meanwhile, has called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and United Nations-led negotiation to resolve the conflict between the two sides.
We gather here united by our deep concern at the unprecedented conflict that has engulfed Gaza and Israel, and our distress at the depth and extent of human suffering. As South Africa, we hold the firm view that the attack on civilians in Israel and the ongoing siege of Gaza and the decision to forcibly move the people of Gaza, together with the indiscriminate and cruel use of force through bombing, destruction of infrastructure, that these are violations of international law. More than that, these attacks are an affront to our common humanity. We call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We call for the release of hostages, the lifting of the siege of Gaza, and we also call for the opening of humanitarian corridors so that basic necessities such as food, medicines, can go through, so that provisions of human aid that are required for the people of Palestine can go through. We also call for a United Nations-led negotiation process towards resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The international community has a duty and a responsibility to support peace and to create favorable conditions for negotiations and dialogue. As South Africans, we can relate to what is happening to Palestinians. Our people waged a brave and courageous struggle to achieve their freedom and were subjected to untold suffering, just like the Palestinians are going through. But we had courageous leaders who were able to set aside their differences and sued for peace, and were able to bring the abhorrible system of apartheid to an end. So we call on all parties to exercise restraint, and on all state actors to desist also from providing weapons to either of the two sides to this conflict.
So how effective can the meeting in Egypt be in attempting to de-escalate the conflict? We're joined now by Africa-Asia Dialogue Senior Research Fellow Thembisa Fakude. Thembisa, thank you. What do you think can be achieved since there are no top officials there from Israel or the United States?
Well, nothing much is going to be achieved as long as the United States remain backing Israel in this regard. So until you have pressure coming from the United States, you are unlikely to see any movement. But hopefully with the release of the two hostages, which was negotiated by Qatar, I think there will be an expansion in terms of how many trucks with aid can go through. At the moment, it's only 20. And the hope, of course, is that as the situation cools down, you are going to be seeing more and more aid flowing to Gaza. But for now, I think this is not going to achieve much, mainly because the Israelis are not part of these negotiations. Second, as I've said, is that the United States continues to support the Israelis in their continuing bombardment of Gaza.
Let's just look at who's attending. China said it would send an envoy for the Middle East. Russia sent a deputy minister. We, of course, are there. But in a sense, it's European countries and Arab countries coming together to find a stance here. Won't that be powerful if they do stand together?
Well, it will be powerful, but we know that Israel does not really respect the Arab leaders. The fact that they will go and do what they are continuing to do in Gaza, notwithstanding that they want normalized relations with major countries in the region, including Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. They've had long normalized relationship with Egypt and Jordan, but they still went ahead and continuing doing what they're doing, notwithstanding that they are the occupier or occupiers in Gaza. It shows you that they've got no respect for nor do they fear any repercussions from the Arab countries. So until you have the grassroots uprising and forcing their governments to be much more harsher on Israel, because they can be, you are likely to have these talk shops continuing, but I don't think they're going to yield any results as long as the Israelis are out of the negotiations and indeed Americans continue supporting Israel.
Aid is going through, and like you said, Hamas has released 2 hostages because of the efforts of Qatar. So is that a real breakthrough?
Well, it is a breakthrough. One hopes, of course, that the numbers are going to increase from 20 to at least 50. But until then, I don't see easing of tensions in the region, nor do I see the increase of supplies into Gaza, because those 2, they were in exchange for some humanitarian aid. We don't know what form that's going to be taking place, but one hopes, of course, that there's going to be an increase in the number of trucks that are going to be allowed going into Gaza. And as the more Hamas agrees to release some of the hostages, and by the way, the bodies of those that have died, some of them were taken by Hamas, they're going to be continue using that as a bargaining chip for their own relief efforts into Gaza.
Ramaphosa is talking about UN-led negotiations, but the fact is there have been so many attempts to find some sort of peace settlement over the years. And obviously this is a very hard question to answer because of all the twists and turns, because of the history, the complex situation. But if you try and look at it objectively or logically, why have the talks always failed?
Well, it's a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that the Israelis tend to play musical chairs. If you think about it, the number of prime ministers that have been in Israel over the past at least 3-4 years creates a challenge in terms of continuing negotiations with that disturbance. But also Israel also continues to violate basic conditions for negotiations. The expansion of settlements is a problem. The continuation of suffocation of Gaza, for example, in occasions both in the West Bank and in Gaza, makes it very difficult for the Palestinians to engage in meaningful talks. The continuing bombardment, as I've said earlier on, that's currently taking place. And 2 years before that, you had another bombardment. In 2014, it was the West's form of bombardment of Gaza. So all of those kind of things create stumbling blocks in terms of meaningful negotiations between Israel and Palestine. And until you have those conditions met, mainly the ceasing of expansion of settlements, particularly in the West Bank, you are likely not to have any progress in terms of negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Thembisa, just to challenge you, is it all Israel? What's happening in Gaza right now, for example, is beyond belief. Many calling for restraint. But are we recognizing that there are still hostages being held, children, the elderly, and Hamas does have a history, which is also in contravention of global war standards, of using civilians as shields?
Well, that's what Israel is saying, that Hamas is using women and children as shields. But it's not the first time that Israel has gone into Gaza and indiscriminately bombed Gaza, way before this current conflict. And numbers...
So don't you believe there are?
Oh, of course there are. But if you look at pictures and television and numbers of people that are killed in both sides, you can't compare between the two. You have thousands of Palestinians that have been killed over the past, at least from 2017 when Hamas took over power. And if you look at the number of Israelis that have been killed by rockets, not to say anyone condones that, I mean, it's chalk and cheese in terms of who is currently suffering in terms of human costs, in terms of economic cost and infrastructure in this regard. It's been disproportionate in terms of who has been really incurring a lot of cost, not only in Gaza, by the way, including the West Bank. So until the occupying power, in this case Israel, decides to push ahead with negotiations, and you have neighbors blaming Israel for stalling the talks, and not only neighbors blaming Israel for stalling the talks, there's been a number of reports from human rights organizations that criticizes Israel for basic violation of human rights and international law. So the blame is with the occupier this time around, and Israel is an occupying force. They've got power to switch on the light, switch off the lights, switch off water, cut aid and all of that. And the blame will squarely rest with them when it comes to pushing forward and encouraging talks between the Palestinians and themselves.
All right, thank you. As always, Africa-Asia Dialogue Senior Research Fellow Thembisa Fakude.